Friends, we need to talk. About hoops. Not that kind of hoop. Hoop skirts. Hoop skirts go by a lot of different names. Most people today use the term interchangeably with crinoline or just hoops. I've even heard some people call them petticoats. I will break down some of those terms as we go through the video. Hello friends! Welcome back to all of my subscriber friends. And if you're new, come on in. Before we get started, I'm going to do the YouTuber things and remind you to hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. And make sure that bell is turned on if you want to get updates on when I upload. My uploads can be a bit sporadic, so that way you know you'll never miss one. Additionally, down in the description box is a link to my social spots, Facebook, Instagram, and Ko-fi. If you enjoyed this video and would like to support my channel financially, head on over to Ko-fi and donate some spare change. I promise every penny will be well spent, even though we don't have pennies in Canada anymore. And finally, question of the day. What is your favorite absurd fashion? Past or present? Sleeves so long that you can't eat, or dresses so tight they show every lump? Let me know down in the comments. So, where did this strange fashion choice start from? Why would someone wear one of those things? The first hoop skirts in Western fashion were called the Spanish farthingale, and this video is going to focus primarily on Western fashion, primarily English fashion, as I don't know enough about fashion in the rest of the world to really talk sensibly about it. Supposedly, the first person to wear it was Joan of Portugal, who, despite that name, lived much of her whole life in Spain. I have to tell you, I found when doing my research on this, the history of Joan of Portugal is fascinating. So many interesting stories. I don't have time to explore her whole life in detail in this video, but I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes because it's that good. Joan of Portugal was born after her father, King Edward of Portugal, had already died. Her mother, Eleanor of Aragon, had been named regent for her son Afonso, who was only 6 years old when Edward died. However, Eleanor was unpopular with the people, and the late king's brother ended up becoming the regent instead. In poor health, Eleanor fled into exile with her younger children, who obviously included Joan. Joan was then married at the age of 15 to King Henry IV of Aragon, and it was rumored that her marriage was never consummated, as her husband was supposedly impotent. She had 3 children, in spite of these rumors, and the eldest, a girl who was also named Joan, ended up losing the throne after her father's death to her cousin, Isabella of Castile, who was mother to Catherine of Aragon, who was the wife of King Henry VIII of England. You with me? Isabella, Queen of Castile, had married Ferdinand of Aragon, and they created a united Spain. And then they set off the Inquisition and the colonization of the Americas. So, you know, it wasn't like she was a saint. Anyway, the story behind the farthingale, which was completely unsubstantiated that I could find, was that Joan of Portugal was A, ticked off because people thought she cut her gowns too low in the front, and B, she was pregnant with one of her 2 younger children. Now, these children were born when she was living apart from her husband, so they were very obviously not his. Anyway, she supposedly created this hooped skirt to disguise these completely, and I quote, immoral pregnancies. Okay, well, that's a good story. I tend to take any story about scandalous women with a huge grain of salt. Looking at this logically, first of all, that's not how pregnancy works. Like, I fail to see how this could disguise this. I am especially skeptical about any history saying that Joan of Portugal was immoral and scandalous because, as I said, her daughter Joan, the king's daughter, or at least enough of the king's daughter to pretend about it, lost the throne of Castile to Isabella, which meant that Isabella is the one who was left in charge of writing down history. Therefore, I'm not hugely surprised that Joan's legacy is not a good one. Isabella had a vested interest in making herself, she was only the king's niece, look much more legitimate. The farthingale arrived in England and all over Europe with brides who were leaving Spain and bringing the new fashion with them to other countries. For England, it's said that the farthingale arrived with Catherine of Aragon. However, one of the reasons that she was so well loved by the English people was that she assumed English dress. Maybe it was just her ladies who were wearing it? Who knows? We for sure don't. Anyway, the Spanish farthingale, or verduago, looked like this, and was originally worn outside the gown to show it off as the fashionable accessory that it was. Gradually, it moved under gowns, providing shape and helping to keep heavy skirts from getting tangled up between your legs. As time and fashion moved on, however, the Spanish farthingale and its cone shape gave way to the French roll farthingale. This was basically a pillow that made your skirts hang a little ways out from your body. Elizabeth I was sent one by the French ambassador so that she could be totally up to date in her fashion. Janet Arnold, that saint of the historical dress community, has theorized that the roll would be worn in addition to the Spanish farthingale. And then along came the great farthingale, or the cartwheel farthingale. This is something I associate strongly with Elizabeth I. There are quite a few mentions of her owning cartwheel farthingales or great farthingales in her dressing books. This farthingale creates that very Elizabethan look of, my dress is actually an end table. So, it comes right out straight from the sides of the skirt and then straight down to the floor. All of these farthingales were made only by experts. They were made from reeds, cane, and some types of grass, depending on where you were. Therefore, they were very expensive. And of course, they were worn only by the fantastically wealthy. Poor women and those of the middling sort would not have had the resources to buy one. Farthingales eventually faded from fashion. And then panniers came in during the 1700s. These have really been explored and researched by people who are far more knowledgeable than me. So I'm just going to leave it there. By the time the French Revolution came around, however, panniers and all kinds of skirt supports were so thoroughly associated with the decadent upper classes that they went out of fashion with a quickness once it was no longer desirable to show the world all of the wealth and power you had, because showing it had, shall we say, consequences. As the 19th century started, dresses were slim and practically see-through, according to the satirists. But as the century marched on and the new queen, Victoria, took the throne, skirts again began to get fuller and fuller. This fullness in the 1830s and 1840s was achieved with many petticoats or underskirts. By the time the 1850s had started, some women were wearing up to 6 stiffened petticoats every day. Petticoats could be corded, which means they were sewn with channels that had rope in them, or they could be stiffened with horsehair, known as crin. The petticoats themselves were usually made from linen. These were known as crinolines. These petticoats, all of them plain corded or crinoline, were heavy, and they had to be washed, and they were hot. And worst of all, they inhibited women's movement. If you've ever worn a long skirt on a windy day, you might know exactly what I'm talking about. Having a skirt bind up between your legs is embarrassing and uncomfortable, and that's when the skirt is a single layer. Imagine trying to run, for instance, while wearing 6 or 7 petticoats, plus your gown. Now, many modern people have this idea that they would not indulge in such ridiculous fashion, that they wouldn't care about the shape of their skirts. They say, I wouldn't wear that, that's ridiculous. However, it's very likely that you would, in fact, wear that. Bucking the fashion trends here in the 21st century can be difficult. You could get rude comments, or your unusual clothing may even keep you from getting a job you wanted. Those consequences were even more severe in the age of Victoria, when being neat and tidy were things to look for in a maid, or someone to rent your property, or even just when it came down to picking which of 2 people had just shoplifted something. It was never the person who was dressed in smart clothes. This quote from Maclean's magazine sums up this phenomenon. Quote, Elizabeth Semmelhack, senior curator at Toronto's Bata Shoe Museum, refuses to see fashion extremes and the risks people took to remain in vogue as ridiculous. Not following fashion was equally perilous, she says. If idealized femininity is about women's participation in fashion, and if femininity or beauty was the major thing you are judged and valued by, then, if you reject it, trust me, all hell breaks loose." End quote. The first hoop skirts in the mid-1800s, like the farthingales before them, were made from reed and cane. But these were not strong enough for the weight of Victorian skirts, and they broke frequently. I suspect the more bell-like shape desired at the time versus the cone shape that had been desired in the age of farthingale was also one of the reasons behind these breakages, but really that's just my own theory. There were also hoops that were made from brass, which was stronger, but had no flexibility, which made moving and sitting extremely difficult. It was, therefore, even more uncomfortable than petticoats and crinolines. There was even a brief phase of inflatable crinolines, which was about as successful as you'd imagine. However, the cartoonists had a field day with these. Finally, in 1856, a British patent was granted for a cage crinoline. You can see how they arrived at the name. It's a cage that does the job of a crinoline. And it was made from spring steel. That meant you could bend the steel a little while walking through doors or to sit down, and it would simply pop back into shape. These hoops were a revelation. Let's imagine it for a moment. Your whole adolescent and your early adult life, you've worn 1,000,001 petticoats. I exaggerate, but you get it. A friend tells you about this new cage crinoline, and maybe you're a bit skeptical. You've heard about them, but you also heard that they were either so stiff as to be uncomfortable or that they break a lot. But you decide to go and see them in the shop. And you try on a set. You can move like never before. The skirt feels bouncy and light. You feel amazing. Take this quote from Ladies' Newspaper in 1863. Quote, "So perfect are the wave-like bands that a lady may ascend a steep stair, lean against a table, throw herself into an armchair, pass to her stall at the opera, and occupy a further seat in a carriage, without inconveniencing herself or others, and provoking the rude remarks of observers, thus modifying, in an important degree, all those peculiarities tending to destroy the modesty of Englishwomen. And lastly, it allows the dress to fall in graceful folds." End quote. Spring steel was a runaway success. Not only was it much more comfortable than crinoline petticoats, but it was also able to be mass-produced. Unlike farthingales, which were only worn by the rich, cage crinolines were affordable and were worn by anyone who could get their hands on them. As I said, appearance was heavily judged in Victorian England, and if you didn't have the correct appearance, you were considered to be morally bankrupt. And for the mid-19th century, that correct appearance meant a lady wearing a cage crinoline. This surge of interest and availability in the up-to-date fashions made rich women very unhappy. There is more than one satirical drawing of the lady of the house telling her maid to go change, or depicting a maid wearing a hoop while doing her duties, and the havoc such a thing would cause. In reality, of course, hoops came in different sizes, and poorer women wore smaller hoops, or fewer hoops. There were other benefits to cage crinolines. They provided air and circulation around the legs, which was a wonderful change for those in warmer climates. One of the associations people have with hoop skirts is Gone with the Wind, and it's easy to see why someone living in a hot, humid climate like Georgia might prefer a garment that provides a breeze under their skirt. With all of these facts put together, women roundly considered that they had been freed. Amelia Bloomer, of Bloomer fame, considered that since women had rejected her reasonable invention of bloomers, a cage crinoline was the next best thing. Suffragettes considered them an important step on the way to being able to live and work out in a man's world. Additionally, newly freed black women who had been enslaved enjoyed wearing cage crinolines by all accounts. Black and white women in America of all classes and social standings wore hooped skirts, including First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln and her African-American dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, who created many of Mrs. Lincoln's own extravagant crinolines. Jacqueline Jones writes in her book, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family, from Slavery to Present. Quote, "White city dwellers in particular often associated insolent behavior with modes of freed women's dress that defied the traditional code of black subordination. In his description of a Charleston street scene in the mid-1860s, so unlike anything we could imagine before the war. Henry W. Ravenel implied that there was more than a casual connection between the two. Negroes shoving white persons off the walk, Negro women dressed in the most outre style, all with veils and parasols for which they have an especial fancy, riding on horseback with Negro soldiers, and in carriages. The abandonment of deference and old clothes, plus the presence of proud black soldiers in uniform, signaled an imminent struggle over social equality, according to the apprehensive whites." End quote. Sadly, these stories may account a little for why crinolines went out of style. As I said earlier, it's very important to consider the context of criticism. For instance, this set of photos that show a crinoline so wide it required special equipment to put it on is actually satirical. It's meant to exaggerate the absurdities of cage crinolines. This exaggerated absurdity mostly came from male cartoonists and illustrators, in the same vein as criticism of corsets in the 19th century, girdles in the 20th century, and shapewear and makeup in our modern day. Men have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Alexander Maxwell has summarized crinoline mockery as expressing the male author's insecurity and fears that women, whose crinolines took up enough space for 5, would eventually conquer mankind. Julia Thomas, observing the extent of Punch's anti-crinoline sentiment and mockery, noted that the magazine's attacks, rather than crushing the phenomenon, exacerbated and even invented the phenomenon of crinoline mania. There was also some kind of absurd idea that your unmarried daughter or your wife could somehow conceal a lover inside the skirt, and you, the male man of the house, would have absolutely no idea he was there, somehow. Again, this just seems exaggerated and like men were just making up excuses to dislike crinolines. Now, with all that said, I absolutely acknowledge that it is not appropriate to wear a crinoline in all circumstances. They were undoubtedly a challenge in windy weather, and sadly, they were also a potential fire risk. For instance, the death of a 14-year-old kitchen maid called Margaret Davy was reported in the Times on the 13th of February, 1863. Her dress, distended by a crinoline, caught fire because she was using the fireplace fender as a stool to get down some spoons from the mantelpiece. Sadly, she died from her extensive burns. The deputy coroner commented that he was, quote, "astonished to think that the morality from such a fashion was not brought more conspicuously under the notice of the Registrar General," end quote, and declared the cause of death to be, quote, "accidental death by fire caused through crinoline," end quote. And she was by no means the only one. There are said to be around 3,000 women and girls who died because of crinolines. These deaths would either be caused by fire or could be caused by the steel hoops catching in wagon wheels or other moving pieces. Factory equipment was another risk, and hoops were eventually banned from the factory floor. These deaths are hard to verify, however. Not all coroners were as upfront about their conclusions that cage crinolines were partially responsible. The fact that poor Margaret was a kitchen maid undoubtedly helped him to speak out so plainly. I doubt he would have said the same thing if Margaret had instead been a gentleman's daughter. The other hazard that hoops may have caused was in evacuations. Many authors tell a story about a church which caught fire, and all the people who died inside it were women and children, as they could not easily evacuate due to all the hoop skirts. Or, others claim, they died because so much fabric fed the fire. I think these stories are referring to the Church of the Company of Jesus in Santiago, Chile. Again, many sources don't offer any source of their own, or name the church even. However, knowing what we do of fire safety in the Victorian age, I'm hesitant to blame all of the deaths on cage crinolines alone. Having read about the incident, which occurred on the 8th of December, 1863, it seemed that there were many issues that caused these deaths. Crowded conditions, full of candles, lamps, and hanging veils, and priests prioritizing valuables over people were both issues, as well as the fact that there was no organized fire brigade. Additionally, it appears that most of the men who escaped did so by following the priests through the back door of the church. At the front door, where the women and children were trying to evacuate, there were too many people pushing and shoving. That is where the hoop skirts caused havoc. When people began to push, they would fall on the skirt of the person in front of them, then both women were stuck and they blocked the exits. Like many of these incidents in the mid-19th century, this tragedy, which caused the deaths of between 2,000 and 3,000 people, prompted changes at home and abroad as word of the incident traveled through newspapers and journals worldwide. In Santiago, they had formed an organized volunteer fire brigade by the 20th of December, just over 2 weeks after the incident. In my research, I kept seeing the same phrase. There were fire-resistant fabrics available, but they weren't worn because they weren't considered attractive. At first I was confused because wool? Wool is fire-resistant and was worn heavily throughout the Victorian era, but further reading revealed that they meant for evening wear. Evening wear was much more likely to be something floaty and lightweight, like silks and cottons, which were more likely to catch light and cause a problem. Additionally, it makes sense that the risk would be greater at night. It's usually colder at night, and heat at the time was provided by fire, either open fire, coal fire, or peat fire. And you would also have candles and lamps for light. So yeah, fire was a problem. But despite the drawbacks, for women, particularly suffragettes and others fighting to help women become more independent, cage crinolines made it easier to move through a world where people wanted to stand in your way. When speaking to people in the modern-day body positivity community, it is frequently observed that it feels like an unspoken rule that women are only permitted to take up a certain amount of space. Many friends who are both tall and plus-sized have said that to them it feels taboo just to exist, because they are taking up more than their allotted space. This is not solely a modern phenomenon. Women have felt like this back into prehistory. I'm no biblical scholar, and am not even Christian, but I still remember the story of the woman who was listening to Jesus talk and was scolded by her sister for staying with the men when she ought to be in the kitchen. I can imagine the hoop skirt to feel a little like a shark cage, a safe way to enforce boundaries and make people move out of the way and allow you through. It doesn't surprise me that all these styles, large sleeves, huge skirts, ridiculous as they may seem to the modern eye, were all coming to prominence in a century where women were exploring their roles outside the home more and more. In fact, I could almost say that maybe it's time to take up some boundary-enforcing undergarments again. Thank you for listening to my thoughts on hoop skirts. Again, hit the like button if you liked the video. Feel free to share it, and I will hopefully be back very soon with another video. Bye!